this photo became this yarn palette.
Hey guys, it's Lexi, and in today's video, I am doing a deep dive into just how I chose colors from one photo to make a cohesive color palette. We'll choose the photo, break down the colors, and turn it into yarn that you can actually create your project with. If this kind of photo to yarn process is helpful to you guys, I am thinking about making more of them. So with that, let's jump in. Okay, so today we're going to focus on picking a palette from one single photo. And the reason I want to share this with you guys is because it does help to reduce overwhelm. There are so many options when you're picking a color palette. Oftentimes it becomes a little much. So if you narrow your focus down to one singular photo, you're able to pick the color palette easier and also faster. This does cut down a lot of time in the process. If you can pick one photo with some good qualities about it, then you will be able to pick your palette a lot quicker. While you're browsing for your photo, there are a few good pointers to keep in mind. So overall, you want to have good contrast within the photo. You want to make sure there are big differences between darks and lights and different tones and values. Also, you want to see that there's a clear mood or story in the photo. Another thing to consider is that there's good texture shown throughout the image. And then lastly, you want it to be inspirational, which sort of ties back to the good story or mood. Of course, this is a really personal thing. So what's inspirational to one may not be to another. So this is where you get to really personalize and think about what you want to represent throughout your piece. So now we're going to look at a few photos that might not be optimal in this context. So something you really want to think about avoiding is low contrast. So like we mentioned before, it's helpful if you have bright lights and dark darks within your photo and then everything in between. If you choose a photo like this, where there's fairly low contrast, it may make it a bit trickier to select a color palette that actually pops within your work. Kind of going along with that, flat colors. Anything that looks muddy or a little convoluted, you're not quite sure what colors you're looking at. You can see in this photo that a lot of the colors and tones really blend together. And I think mostly it's because the photo itself is very dark overall. This could go in the opposite direction, where if a photo is very light overall, you may have the same type of issue. Now, again, this is all personal preference. So maybe you're looking for something that doesn't have a lot of contrast, or maybe you'd like the color work to be a little less stand out. But overall, if you're going to put in the work to a color work palette or project, it's helpful to pick a photo or pick references that allow you to choose colors that actually pop and will stand out within your work. Now, conversely, something else to avoid would be an overly busy image or something that doesn't really have a clear palette. As you can see in this photo, while it's visually interesting and kind of a neat photo, there are a lot of things going on here. There's many, many, many colors, not really a clear direction. And I'm not saying you couldn't make a palette from this photo. I think it would be really difficult to convey a tight color palette here. And while this may not be shown in this photo specifically, I would avoid heavy filters. So for example, in the previous photo, it was very dark overall. Sometimes heavy filters that distort colors can make it more difficult to pick a clear color palette. All right, so we're going back to the photo that we've chosen here, and I'm going to talk you through how I ended up choosing this color palette. So like I've mentioned, I'm using Canva here. I think it's a great platform to help pick out colors and create layouts that make sense. So you can go in with the eyedropper tool and, hover over different parts of the image and actually pick a color, including the hex code. If you're not familiar, a hex code is a string of letters and numbers that designates a particular color. In this case, I looked to the water here for the lightest light. There are lights within the sky, but I felt like this water, this sort of gray neutral, would be a great background color for the project. So as you can see here, that's what we've selected for the main color of the project. Moving forward in the background, you see here we have this darker rock. So we see it present in the mountains, but we also see it present on the shoreline here, where there's a lot of rocky terrain. It's sort of like a dark blackened blue-gray. And I thought that would be great for the second color or the main contrast color here. So this color is really going to support a lot of the pops of color or accents that we choose next. So this will sort of act as our frame. And depending on how many colors you have in your project, it's going to kind of depend on how many accent colors you pick here. So for the purpose of this demonstration in this project, I chose 2 accent colors. And I came even more forward into the photo and into the ground. So you see that there are these really pretty lavender flowers and this really interesting kind of umber copper colored moss on the rocks. So I chose those two colors specifically because I felt like they would contrast the blue really well. They would stand out really well against our main background of that creamy gray color as well. This is where you get to play around. You can select different colors with the eyedropper, but either way, you want to start playing around with colors that are contrasting enough from your background and your secondary color that will make an impact when you go to swatch things up. You could have chosen, this greenish lichen or perhaps this bright green moss here. So there's a lot of different variety in this photo, and that's part of why I chose it. You really could have a project that has 5, 6, 7 or more colors here. But again, it depends on the pattern, depends on, what type of color work you're doing, but there's a lot of options. And certainly there's a lot of things that contrast each other. That's why it's so important to pick a photo that has so much value within it between light and dark, many different tones and colors. So you do have options and you can play around with different palettes. Now I'm going to show you what it looks like when you pick colors that maybe are a little muddy here. So you can see we have our main palette that we've just gone through. And then next to it, I picked out colors that are sort of also in the photo, but not so different from each other. So you can see, it's possible that maybe I would have selected this medium gray color from somewhere in the rocks. And like I mentioned, this lichen is sort of a really interesting color, this minty green, and it's close to other tones of rock. And also this comes up where there's sort of moss and lichen. While this color palette on the right-hand side of the screen is pretty in all these blues and grays and greens, it's really not probably best suited for a color work palette. And that's because there's really not enough contrast here within your value. So from light to dark, and also from the colors themselves. So we're doing a lot of blues and greens here, and it just likely would result in a muddy color work, which, again, it's personal preference and what you're going for. Maybe you want sort of a gradient at some point, but really you'd want to get some darker and brighter colors in there to punch things up. So maybe you'd swap out this blue with a really dark blue, or much darker than this even perhaps, or maybe you'd go white here instead of gray, just to kind of mix it up and actually show contrast. Because once you guys get into swatching, you'll see that if your yarn does not have enough difference between the colors, you're likely not to get the result that you're thinking of or that you're hoping for. Okay, and so now we're going to walk through how to turn our chosen color palette here on the left into actual yarn. All right, and as you can see, I've brought you over to woolencompany.com. As I've mentioned before, I live in Connecticut in the United States, and oftentimes I do shop on Wool & Company. They have a very wide selection of brands and colorways, and sometimes it's just easier, especially if you're sourcing a lot of colors for one project. However, of course, feel free to go in store at a local yarn shop or somewhere nearby. And that's also a very nice way to really be able to see the colors and how they work together. Speaking a little bit more to the yarn type you may use, it's important to think about fiber here, of course, in relation to your pattern, but also in relation to the colors. I know I like to use Knitting for Olive oftentimes. Actually, this sweater I knit from Knitting for Olive when I'm doing color work projects because they have such a huge selection of colors in their yarn and in all of their different bases of yarn. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to look at Knitting for Olive today. And so you can see they have a lot of different bases. And for today, we're going to look at their merino. And you'll see as I scroll down, they really do have quite a wide selection of colors, which is wonderful, especially when you're trying to match up colors from a palette. So what I would start to do at this point is look at the color palette that I've created and match up colorways to individual colors. So for example, this mustard color looks pretty similar to the color that I chose for our palette. And you'll see that it is indeed on our board and is a very nice match for this golden mustardy color. So you just continue to do that, looking at the colors that you've selected and trying to get as close as possible. Now, of course, you're not always going to be able to hit the color right on the nose. And one example of this is sort of with the purple. You can see here, this purple swatch is definitely a little darker than the actual color that I ended up selecting, but in this case, I actually think it helps the palette because this tone is pretty even with the mustard tone in terms of depth and contrast. So while the colors are contrasting, the value of the tone is somewhat similar. So I actually like that this color is a little brighter, a little lighter, and kind of contrasts this mustard color even more. And something else to consider here is giving yourself a little bit of wiggle room if colors are out of stock or unavailable or just not made in a certain line of product. So for example, This artichoke purple color is a fairly new colorway for knitting for Olive, but before that, I'm not sure that something exactly that close existed. So you may have to be a little flexible. Maybe I would go for something a bit more pink in this case, or maybe I would take it in a totally different direction and go for the mint that I showed you in the alternative color palette. So it's a good idea to not be too set on what you've created, but do your best to match it and think about, what might be a good substitution if you're unable to find the exact color that you're looking for. And of course, you always want to make sure you do a swatch. Now, I don't have these yarn colorways in my possession at this point, so I'm not going to be able to show you an actual swatch of what this looks like. But if I were actually going to carry out this project and use this yarn, I would definitely want to swatch these colors next to each other. Make sure there was enough difference in value, in tone, and contrast, just to be sure that the project will turn out like I have in mind. And if you guys haven't seen my color palette video prior to this, I'm going to link it up in the cards for you and take a look at it, because there's a couple of tricks that I mentioned where when you're swatching, there are things you can do to make sure that you're actually seeing things correctly and you're going to have enough contrast in your colorways. I'm going to put up the colorway names on the screen for you here, just in case this is something you would like to recreate on your own. Again, it's Knitting for Olive in their merino base, and oftentimes they do have the same colors in their heavy merino and soft silk mohair. But yeah, just in case it's something you're interested in, I thought I would provide it for you. All right, so now we're gonna go over some common mistakes to avoid. One is using too many midtones, and this is pretty much what I was talking about with that alternative color palette with a lot of the greens and the blues, where there just isn't enough contrast and all of the colors sort of blur together. I mean, if you squint at that photo, they start to blend and you can't really see where one color ends and the next begins, which really is the point here. Again, some of it is personal preference and what exact look you're going for, but oftentimes with color work, you just want to make sure there's enough contrast between your colorways so that all the hard work that you put into the pattern truly stands out. Another mistake is picking colors that look good in the photo but then really vanish in knitting. And this again may be too many midtones, or maybe a color that just doesn't quite translate into the yarn. So it could be something like a very bright color or even a very dark color where you just don't see the nuance enough. I know sometimes in dark greens and blues, it almost can look black. And so you're losing that special nuance that maybe you saw in the color on the screen, but when you look at it in knitting in natural light or in any setting that you may be wearing your garment, it really fades away and it just doesn't read. The last thing to consider is fiber impact on color perception. So what does this mean? Basically, different fiber has different properties, right? And so as you're looking at a color of fiber, it may look very different from base to base. So I think Knitting for Olive does a great job with this, and that's kind of why I keep bringing this brand up. Their soft silk mohair in a color may look very different in a merino base. You want to consider, does the fiber you're choosing have a halo? Is it fuzzy? Is it shiny? Does it have light absorbing properties where you're really not seeing a lot of the color because it's just absorbing a lot of the light around it? And I think swatching can be super helpful here. So that's why it's so important to swatch your color palette, swatch the combinations that you're interested in, and really give it some thought as to how it looks in different lighting. Sometimes you can use it for your advantage. Sometimes it's really beautiful to soften edges out with a mohair or an alpaca, or maybe you want the sheen of a silk or a fabric that has a slip to it. But it's just important to be aware of these different things because they do impact the overall design and effect of your color work, and you really want to make sure that, again, the work that you're putting into it, because let's face it, it's a lot of work and time, really comes out the way that you envision it in your head. All right, so quickly to recap here, you want to pick your photo, you want to pick your main supporting and accent colors, then you want to translate those colors into yarn, and then swatch. If you're watching this and you're thinking that you have the perfect photo to try this with, please let me know in the comments. I would love to hear what it is. And so starting with just one photo, we went from inspiration to a yarn palette that really works. If you guys found this video helpful, please let me know. I'm actually thinking of making more videos like this with different photos, so comment down below. And next, I'm thinking of showing you how I take the same idea and build a full knitting mood board from scratch. So thanks again for watching this video, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye.